OneXPlayer's inaugural foray into handheld Android gaming has arrived, and with a vengeance. Like Macbeth himself, it steps onto the stage with ambition burning through its veins, eager to seize a crown already worn by others. But just like Shakespeare's tragic hero, that ambition comes with complications. Because the OnexSugar doesn't stride confidently into battle. It stumbles, experiments, and mutates its way into something stranger. A handheld that's part Android console, part Nintendo DS fever dream, and part mechanical monstrosity. It's a machine born from bold ideas and risky partnerships, and it's not afraid to look different doing it. Now, before we go further, we've got some drama. My time with the Sugar was cut very short, only 3 days. In that window, I tested everything I could until the fan gave out completely. The device suffered a full hardware failure and had to be shipped back to China for repair. So everything you're about to hear comes from a very intense, very brief window with a unit that did not survive the honeymoon phase, unfortunately. And I'm going to do my best not to review from a place of frustration and anger, because things happened and people get wildly unlucky, but I may not be able to hold my ire. So if I sound a bit clipped or upset, or you see a lot of the same clips over and over again and maybe mostly direct capture, well, now you know why. This is going to be a very scuffed episode. And that's kind of poetic, isn't it? A device this ambitious undone by its own hubris and grand designs. Which in turn raises the question, does the OnexSugar have real staying power? Is this a platform worth believing in, or just another beautifully flawed experiment destined for the collector's shelf? Well, without further ado, let's dive in. It's important to note that the OnexSugar is not a bespoke OneXPlayer design. It's being made in close collaboration with a much smaller company called Sugar Cubes. If you haven't heard of them, well, you're not alone. They mostly operate in the shadows of Chinese social media circles, putting out boutique gaming accessories and experimental devices. The kind of stuff that never makes it overseas, well, until now. Sugar Cubes first made waves with their metal controller case for the Microsoft Surface Duo. It was one of those projects that felt ahead of the time, clever engineering wrapped around an otherwise awkward piece of hardware. More recently, they teamed up with Small Universes to create an emulation handheld, and the standout feature there? A rotating screen. Not exactly mass market, but it is undeniably innovative. And they've also struck out with a Nokia N97 inspired device. You can see a motif throughout their work: bold designs, angular sightlines, and sharper, almost playful-like profiles. And that's their MO, small batch, creative hardware that pushes form factors just a little too far for mainstream companies to touch. And now, with the OnexSugar, this is their first real exposure to the West. But the partnership itself feels risky. OneXPlayer already has a reputation for more conservative devices and design choices. So why would they double down with an even smaller company and a design that looks like the love child of a Galaxy Fold and Nintendo DS? Well, I'm not sure why they doubled down, but if I had to hazard a guess, it was because they wanted to be the first to market with a game-changing dual-screen device. They were certainly first this year with announcements, but the market has spoken, and well, I think this is one of those cases where the first shall be last really does apply. Though I am getting ahead of myself. We can't go any further without discussing the elephant in the room. Arguably, the marquee feature here is the convertible nature of the unit. Thanks to a clever set of hinges, the OnexSugar is a dual-screen convertible handheld. You get a 6.01-inch OLED up top, 1080 by 2160 18:9 aspect ratio, and below that, a 3.92-inch OLED at 1080 by 1240 with a nearly square 8:7 ratio. Both panels are 450 nits, 100% sRGB, and DC dimming is supported. You can run it in 4 different ways. Single screen candy bar mode for your classic horizontal-like gaming experience. Small head mode with the smaller screen on top and the wider one on bottom, dual screen stacked or the full DS style look, game up top, guides or streams in the bottom screen. And then there's my personal favorite, Utter mode, great for ergonomic single screen sessions. It's one of the most versatile form factors we've seen in many years, and I do think this form factor is not as compromised as some might have assumed. Now, don't get me wrong, there are definitely compromises to the design, namely ergonomics and input types in certain modes, but I find myself enjoying this far more than clamshell handhelds on the market. Those options are much more portable and damage resistant, but there is a certain freedom of exercise with the different modes here that you just can't get anywhere else. Like for example, there are times when I'm lying in bed and I'm playing games and I just grow tired of using the DS mode. Makes my arms ache a little bit. So what do? I just switch to Utter mode and my fatigue is relieved. It's novel but useful, which should be this handheld's tagline, because everything about it is just novelty incarnate. From its convertible nature to the sounds it makes as you transform it around, all of it is designed to make you just never grow tired of owning it, like a piece of tech outside of time itself, always new and unique. However, novelty alone cannot carry a device's design. There's gotta be concrete pros to it to make it have staying power, and the Sugar does have its pros. One of those being the overall rounded profile and edges the device has. I figured a design like this might have a few sharp points that they couldn't avoid, but they got around that pretty well. The only flat edges reside at the top of the unit or wherever the main hinge for the smaller screen lies. You only ever get close to it when you're using the triggers, and even then, they built some nice contours around them. There was no way for them to add sculpted grips to this, but it is a valiant effort. My only criticism might be the fact that the exhaust vents for the fan are sometimes by your fingers. Now this handheld never gets the heat levels of a PC handheld, but it can and will expel heat depending on your workload. I've seen the fans in excess of 8,000 RPMs depending on the game. You don't really want to touch that. And speaking of touching, the controls on the OnexSugar are divisive to say the least. They're bold, clicky, and unapologetically mechanical, the kind of design choice that's gonna split opinions right down the middle. The first thing that stood out to me were the face buttons and the triggers. They're all micro switch based, which means every press comes with that distinct tactile click, the kind of feedback you'd expect from an arcade stick. It's instantly satisfying and it completely caught me off guard the first time I used it. But here's the thing, that same clickiness can work against you. In precision-based games, especially platformers, that hard, snappy feel doesn't always translate well. I found myself missing jumps in Mario titles because there's almost no soft feedback or travel to help you kind of time your presses. It feels great in theory, but the rhythm takes a lot of getting used to. This is where the D-pad attachment comes into play. On paper, it's a clever fix, snapping over the face buttons to simulate a proper D-pad layout. In practice though, it's a bit hit or miss. For example, in Mario Kart DS, where the art of snake drifting relies on precise, rhythmic flicks of the D-pad, the attachment adds just enough height and looseness to throw off that timing. It's usable and far better than having no D-pad option at all, but it's not a one-to-one replacement for the real thing. Over time, I could see myself adapting to it, but it's definitely a learning curve that is going to trip up newcomers. If I had to nitpick, the only real way to improve this would be to recess the face buttons just slightly so the D-pad cap sits lower and feels more stable. As it stands, the clickiness is fun, but lacks the cohesion of a traditional D-pad. Still, credit where it's due. I'd rather have the attachment than go without it entirely. Beyond that, you get Hall effect joysticks with RGB halos, smooth, accurate, and about what you'd expect from modern handhelds. And there's a dual vibration setup, a linear motor for subtle feedback, and dual rotor motors for heavier rumble. It works fine, though, I really haven't tested it enough across many games to call out its nuances. It's rumble on Android, it works. The controls tie directly into how comfortable the Sugar feels, because ergonomics completely change depending on which mode you're in. And trust me, not all modes are created equal. Let's start with the standard candy bar mode, which ironically is my least favorite. It's fine for lighter games, stuff where you're mostly moving around and tapping a few buttons, but once things start getting more complex, it becomes cramped very quickly. I find myself sliding the console higher in my hands just to get a better angle on the left stick and the right buttons. It works, but only barely. Try juggling camera control and attack inputs in a 3D action game and you'll quickly realize how much micro adjusting your hands are doing. It's just not built for long, intense sessions. Then there's what I call small head mode, basically when the smaller display is unfolded. Ergonomically, this one feels even stranger. You've got this open gap between your hands where your fingers instinctively want to rest, but can't because it's too far to grip comfortably. The weight distribution ends up awkward, and it feels like your hands are floating rather than anchored. It's usable, but not very pleasant. Now my personal favorite, Utter Mode. And no, it's not just because of the mental image, it's because this configuration actually feels the most natural. When you unfold it downward, it mimics the feeling of having split Joy-Cons, giving your hands space to breathe. Despite being top-heavy, the weight actually acts like a counterbalance. Inputs are easy to reach, your wrists stay relaxed, and it just feels right to me. It's the most comfortable way to play for long stretches. That said, there is a trade-off, and that trade-off is looseness. The detachable controls have a bit of play in them, more than I'm comfortable with. It's not a deal breaker, but it can cause accidental presses if you twist the handles even slightly. And because each handle houses 3 triggers, a bumper, a main trigger, and a macro switch, that looseness sometimes means you'll trigger one without meaning to. Annoying? Absolutely. But that's the price you pay for other comforts. Finally, there's DS mode, which I'd call a close second, or honestly, tied for first. Comfort-wise, it's excellent. The ability to grip the backs of both the hollowed-out display and the controllers give it a surprisingly natural feel. It's angular, sure, but stable. I found myself spending most of my time swapping between DS mode and Utter mode, and I suspect most people will too. Software can make or break these devices, and OneX knows it. On the Sugar you get Android 14 layered with their own launcher called the Sugar Console. It's a control hub where you can swap power modes, remap controls, fiddle with RGB, and jump between different screens without digging through menus, for the most part. It's a very touch and go piece of software. The first couple days were spent trying to figure out what certain features did and even find everything. The UI is unfortunately not very intuitive. It's a cramped and cluttered mess of small icons, random Chinese text, and hidden menus under static elements. Like, take a look at this menu here. How would anyone know that this part of the UI is actually a slider for the brightness? Or more egregious, that this lower part down here houses an entirely hidden menu that lets you disable some UI sounds? Or how about the second screen? See that generic robot icon in the corner? Yeah, that actually houses a button that brings up the secondary display's app tile. It's how you use the second display. And this is why proper QA is important, and not just hype men who don't actually use the device once filming is done. The software is lacking some much needed polish. And this is one of the few signs that this launch was rushed, but more on that later. The console itself can be finicky or unstable. I had a few crashes my first day, or it just locking up. Then there's an ongoing issue where the touchscreen map controls will stop working if a capture card is connected. Or an issue where certain chargers can cause the touchscreen itself to misbehave and not register inputs. Myself and another gent in the OneXPlayer Discord have taken up points on community onboarding and device guides. We're maintaining a comprehensive community spreadsheet that will help any newcomer get up and running. We lay out all the necessary software features and functions that this device has, and I will be linking it down below, and I recommend reading it if you are even remotely interested in the OnexSugar. It's important work because a device like this needs a pretty good onboarding experience. It's not your everyday Android handheld, and you want a buyer to feel good about their purchase. There could definitely be a lot of frustration as you try to set this handheld up. Alright, let's talk specs. At the heart of this thing is Qualcomm Snapdragon G3 Gen 3, an 8-core SoC built on TSMC's 4nm process. The layout's a 1+5+2 setup. One big Cortex X4 Prime core at 3.3 GHz for heavy lifting, 5 performance cores up to 3.2 GHz, and 2 efficiency cores at 2.3. It's paired with the Adreno A33 GPU, which is Qualcomm's latest integrated GPU block for sustained handheld gaming rather than short, intense bursts. And this chip isn't just a repackaged smartphone processor. This is a serious attempt by Qualcomm to build a dedicated line for handhelds, that being the G1, G2, and of course now G3. Each step has now brought a bigger thermal envelope, better sustained clocks, and better implementation of advanced graphical features, things like real-time ray tracing, Unreal Engine 5 Lumen support, and the new Adreno Frame Motion Engine 2.0, which can generate interpolated frames, much like AMD's FSR3. Backing that up is 16 gigs of LPDDR5X, clocked at 8533 megatransfers a second, plus 512 gigs of UFS 4.0 storage. That's pretty quick memory all around. Power comes from a 5600 mAh pack, which we will get into, don't you worry. And then rounding off connectivity, you've got Wi-Fi 7 and Bluetooth 5.3, courtesy of Qualcomm's Fast Connect 7800 system. That's the same module used in the latest flagship phones, which should mean faster cloud gaming response times and lower latency controller sync, both of which I'm sure matters to somebody. Just like the I/O matters to me. Physical I/O is simple but functional. One full-featured USB-C port for data, video, and charging, plus a micro SD slot for expansion, no HDMI out, which is something I do like on my Odin 2 Pro, but I can definitely live without. And at around 486 grams, it's lighter than an Ally and only a hair heavier than an Odin 2 Pro. The weight is a perfect balance to me, and I'm sure the engineers had to really think about how to optimize the space here. So this is a lot of spec salad, but it is very important. Essentially, what Qualcomm's trying to do here is create a dedicated hardware platform for handheld Android gaming. They have taken direct notice of small vendors using their older flagship chips and getting excellent results from them. Someone at Qualcomm saw the success of the Odin 2 Pro and realized that nurturing this sector is a viable strategy. How do I know this? Well, you can go on Qualcomm's site and find devices using their chips. They highlight their hardware partnership with different boutiques, and it's not just a marketing thing. Qualcomm wants to advertise their platform as a viable hardware base. Like, imagine a future Xbox handheld or Nintendo console built on Qualcomm's tech. Okay, it's a very slim chance of happening, but as they say, per chance to dream, I suppose. But what's not a dream is that if developers wanted to, they could build and port current gen games over to the platform. The G3 Gen 3 is a chip that can run circles around the Switch 2. I know it sounds crazy, but if Qualcomm paid for CD Projekt Red to port over The Witcher or the Cyberpunk, we would see real fast how good native Android versus Switch gaming can be. I know a part of Qualcomm and these boutique vendors all want to make Android handhelds feel less like novelty toys and more like credible portable consoles. That's the pitch, and the Sugar's one of many devices trying to prove it. Now, performance was incredibly interesting to me. I had been wanting to see what Qualcomm would do in regards to a true handheld-focused chip, and I must say I am very impressed with what was delivered. So getting emulation out of the way, it's all as excellent as can be. We've got excess power for days. Everything plays well right up to Switch and 3DS, which I imagine is what most of you only really care about. 3DS performance is excellent, but there's a huge caveat to that. These games are quite shader heavy. When shaders are built, then you get great performance, of course. I'm talking full speed in most titles with up to 4x internal resolutions on some games. They look super sharp and very clean. It is the best way to play them, once the shaders are built. Before that though, it's a rocky and painful road to smooth gameplay. Every game is filled with micro stutters and pausing as the game builds the shaders on the fly. Now, the G3 chip has a blazing fast CPU, so your actual compile times are very quick. But with so many shaders, well, that could be anywhere from 5 to hundreds of shaders depending on the scene. I find 3D games with variable gameplay to be the worst. A game like Super Mario 3D Land takes several runs of the same level to stable out performance and capture just about every shader. Luigi's Mansion 2 is another real sticking point as well. So shader heavy. Switch games are also among the same boat, but I will say shader capture here seems to be a more efficient and less strenuous issue on this platform versus 3DS. No, the real issue is that compatibility is very hit or miss on some titles, and you need several emulators to have the best coverage. Like take Mario and Luigi Brothership. In Citron, the game doesn't even render. All the 3D scenes are just not present. Eden is better, but you can end up in Seizure Land depending on the scene and however the render pipeline is feeling that day. Or my favorite JRPG, Xenoblade Chronicles 3. In Eden and Citron, the graphics are quite bugged. Both of them struggle with rendering of subtle effects like ground smoke and light volumetrics. Though Eden has this rare bug where all of the volumetric fog does not render and the scene is filled with grayed out squares. I didn't manage to capture it in time, but it's a rare one I suspect a few other games might suffer from as well. But in lighter news, native Android titles are blazing fast, a real generational uplift versus some older flagships like the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2. According to every Android video I've done so far, it seems like you guys really just don't care. But for the sake of being thorough, I wanted to include some cross comparison anyways. One of my new favorite native Android benchmarks is a game called Meadowfell. It's an open world adventure game where you sort of just wander around, taking in the beauty of nature. Well, I found out it's one of the very few games on the platform that has a crazy extensive settings menu. You can change things like global illumination, anti-aliasing, texture quality, resolution, and many other settings. The menu itself is more tweakable than a lot of modern PC games. So my test setup was to compare both the Odin 2 Pro and Sugar 1 in this ROM through the same region, at ultra quality 1080p and the same highs and effects like GI, contact shadows, and ambient occlusion. Well, I think the results speak for themselves. 24 FPS on average for the Odin 2 Pro, while we get 60 FPS for the Sugar 1. That's a 40% increase from flagship to flagship. And I really suspect that if there were more games taking advantage of native hardware, we would see tons of gains like this. The only dips we see on the Sugar 1 aren't performance hitches. They're for shader compilation, which is going to be a long-running theme with this device. There is so much more testing I plan to do once my device is back from China. One of the biggest points I've been trying to determine is the actual gen-over-gen strength of the platform, and how much gas is in the tank for developers to push emulation and higher-end platforms. In my limited testing, I was not able to get PS3 emulation or procure Wii U ROMs, but from community findings, PS3 is a crapshoot, and Wii U is still very early days. So yeah, performance-wise, the Sugar 1 is kind of a paradox. It's the most capable Android handheld I've ever tested, but it's also the most inconsistent when everything lines up. Shaders cached, drivers cooperating, this thing absolutely sings. It punches so far above what you'd expect from a Snapdragon chip that you start to wonder how much headroom Qualcomm's really been sitting on all these years. If Qualcomm can iron out driver support, and if emulator devs keep tuning for this architecture, we'll be staring at the beginning of a new baseline, not just for the OnexSugar, but for every Android handheld that comes after it. Now let's talk battery life, because this was one of the areas that I did not think much about going in. The Sugar comes with a 5600 mAh cell, noticeably smaller than the 8000 mAh pack inside the Odin 2 Pro, and that size difference absolutely shows in endurance. To test this, I ran both handhelds overnight in what should have been sleep mode, with a Nintendo Switch game still suspended in the background. Each one was put to sleep at 10 p.m. and woken up at 7 a.m. And, well, here's what happened. At first glance at this chart, it sort of makes it look like the Odin is dramatically more efficient, but the real story is more nuanced. When you actually normalize for capacity, the Sugar actually pulls slightly less absolute power, 107 mAh versus 114 mAh. The difference in percentage drain simply comes from the Odin's bigger battery having more headroom. Both devices, however, showed nearly 100% held awake time overnight, which means that a game or some kind of overlay kept the SoC from entering a deeper sleep. So this was more of a light idle test, not a true suspended state. In other words, These numbers represent a pause with a game running drain, not your normal standby drain. If the Sugar is fully closed out of all apps and left in airplane mode, its sleep drain falls closer to 0.3 to 0.5% per hour, which translates to roughly 3 to 4 days of standby per charge. In active use, the 5600 mAh battery is on the modest side. You can expect around 2.5 to 3 hours of heavy emulation or native 3D gaming at full brightness and performance mode, 4 to 5 hours in balance mode with lighter titles, and 7 to 8 hours of video playback or mindless scrolling. Charging is done via USB-C power delivery, topping out around 23 watts, which refills the battery from 0 to 100% in just over an hour and a half, which makes sense as the G3 is an 18-watt TDP part. So while endurance isn't the Sugar's strongest suit, its actual power efficiency is very respectable, and for a Snapdragon G3 based handheld, the results are quite solid. It just may need slight sleep management tweaking to make full use of that promised efficiency. The OnexSugar is one of the most strangest devices I've ever reviewed, and I mean that as both a compliment and a criticism. It's a handheld that feels like it was built by people who love hardware experimentation and who still believe that gaming can be playful, tactile, and weird. And yet, it's also a product that reminds me why ambition alone isn't enough. The hardware is phenomenal. Qualcomm's G3 Gen 3 is a real leap forward. The dual screen design has genuine potential, and for those first few hours, I felt like I was holding something special, a glimpse of where Android handhelds could go if companies stopped playing it so safe. But reality hit very fast. The launch feels rushed. There was no documentation, no proper setup guide, and the software support just isn't there yet. And then there is the price. $699 retail plus another $78 in tariffs. At that cost, this thing isn't competing with budget handhelds or even mid-range handhelds anymore. It's rubbing shoulders with the ROG Ally, the Steam Deck OLED, and even the Lenovo Legion Go. And again, not to just keep beating the dead horse, but my unit did not survive the honeymoon phase. 3 days in, I got 3 days, and the fan catastrophically failed. It had to be shipped back to China for repair, and which, to their credit, OneXPlayer has been handling, and I have not had to come out of pocket. They paid for DHL Express to go back overseas, so I am thankful for that. But that kind of failure on a brand new $700 product does not exactly inspire confidence. So here's where I land. The Sugar One might be the best handheld that I cannot recommend right now. The performance is outstanding, the concept is bold, but the execution just is not stable enough to justify the price. It's a prototype disguised as a retail product, a glimpse of a future I desperately want to exist, but can't have you guys quite buy into yet. You know, my financial misfortune should not be the go-ahead for you to jump off the same cliff as me. If OneXPlayer and Sugar Cubes can tighten the quality control, polish the software up, and support the community the way this hardware deserves, then we might be looking at something truly special, and it would definitely get my recommendation even at its current price. But until then, it's a very sweet idea that's left a bitter aftertaste in my mouth. But that's gonna be it for today. I'm the Silicon Fox, and I'll be signing off. I've got a few more pieces of hardware coming in, well, 2, something from ASUS and then something from Mech DIY again, so I'm excited about that. But until next time, I'm signing off and saying ciao.